This episode of the Warwick F1 Show was filmed in the Rowe studio during the Freshers drop-in sessions, hence it is a fair bit shorter and a fair bit more filled with adverts and interruptions than normal. Next week we will be in the studio again, but we'll be back to full-length programming. Thank you and enjoy.
Hello and welcome back to Raw 12:51am with your head of sport, Will Kingswood. I'm here as part of sort of the first of our drop-ins. I'm here with Cam Hall, our head of sport. Oh, sorry, I'm the head of sport, our head of news. It's going really well. This is my first show, so it's a bit of a new experience for me. So I think just getting better at it is the aim of the game. But yeah, so this is the first of our drop-ins, and we are going to be covering the sport from over the weekend, especially the Russian Grand Prix. I know me and Cam both watched it, but first, let me introduce Cam, actually, obviously our head of news at Raw 12:51am. How you doing, Cam?
I've got to say, Will, it's fantastic to be back. I've missed this studio space so much. I had a week at the end of term before COVID came along and ruined it for me. So it's so nice to be back. And what a fantastic schedule we've got ahead of this year on Raw. I'm really looking forward to it. And as you said, some fantastic stuff to start off with today. Of course, the Russian Grand Prix, you and I were both watching that in the pub. Such a good race. I'm really looking forward to discussing it. And of course, Lewis Hamilton's 100th race win amongst the biggest talking points from that, as well as a fantastic weekend in other sports and just a lot over the last few months. I mean, yeah, I'm just really excited to be, you can tell I'm just really excited to be back and just discussing this right now.
Yeah, it's good to be back in the studio. So, not only are we joined by Cam Hall, we're also joined by Warwick F1 Society's Jack Rowe, who's just arrived in the studio now. How are you doing, Jack?
Hello, I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
Good. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm doing well. Just forgot to put Jack's microphone up there, but it's all good. Yeah. So, how are you doing? Like, obviously, watched the race over the weekend. What do you think of it?
Yeah, it was a bit of a crazy one, wasn't it? It's not meant to be that. Sochi's not usually a good one, but a bit bonkers. Yeah, it's been a while since I saw one that good, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very interesting race. Obviously, we got the rain right at the end. And we are also joined by, I guess, Jack said he was going to bring in a new fresher. So, how are you doing? What's your name?
My name is Chinmay.
Hi, Chin. How are you? I mean, how are you finding your first few days at Warwick?
Yeah, first few days have been good. I mean, just been to a couple of the freshers events lately. And yeah, just been so far so good.
Yeah, so obviously we've got now 3 guests in the studio. I'll just come back to Cam Hall quickly. Give us a rating out of 10 sort of for the race, and then after another song we'll get into it.
I mean, I feel for the Russian Grand Prix, anything higher than a 4 is fantastic. So I will put it at, I'll go for a 7 because I feel, which for Russia, as I said, is exceptional because it started off, I think, there's a bit of a lull early on. I think with the mixed up grid gave a bit more drama, but there was a bit of a lull. But then as soon as I think as Lewis Hamilton got into second, that next second behind Norris, and really just seeing Lewis make that chase, and then of course those last few laps, it was an incredible race. I would go a very secure 7, definitely.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that a bit later. We'll dive into the race, into the start, and into some of the performances. Right, welcome back to Raw 12:51am. Just a few technical difficulties there, but we're back now, and we're going to get started with talking about the Russian Grand Prix. As Cam said, a race that we weren't really expecting to be that good. I know me and Jack spoke about it last week on the first episode of the show. We weren't exactly kind to the track, but we saw on Sunday it really delivered. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well, there's a good reason they're moving to Agora Drive next year, and that's because it doesn't exactly produce classic races, but I'm very glad it did produce a classic one this time round.
Yeah, I mean, Chen, did you watch the race? And I mean, if so, what did you think of it?
I mean, yeah, especially as Sochi goes, it was a fantastically surprising race. I mean, just drama, especially for the second half.
Yeah, I mean, even the drama in the second half, like, we saw a bit of drama in the first half. I mean, we may as well get started at the beginning, at that start. And to be honest, that start, arguably one of the best starts of the year. Like, I think Sochi, for all its flaws, does have one of those runs to the first corner where you really do see action. I mean, at one point, I think we even had almost like five cars wide. And Lando Norris, even after getting his good start, got overtaken by Carlos Sainz at the beginning.
Yeah, it was brilliant, wasn't it? It's always been a good one. The long run down. I can't think of any. What is it? The longest one on the calendar now? I can't remember. I think there might be one longer. I can't remember.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think Italy's obviously up there, and again at Italy we saw the second place driver get into first with Daniel Ricciardo overtaking Max Verstappen. But even after Norris had such a good start, he was like 4 or 5 car lengths ahead of everyone else by the time they went through that kink, but he still managed to get overtaken.
Yeah, it's brilliant as well. I love the kink on there. And I mean, George Russell probably doesn't love that. He was well set up for the slipstream until he got to that point. But yeah, I love that. That's the only bit of that track that I would not change. That first run down. It's so wide as well, and the first corner is an excellent. It's a hard braking zone. You get some real dive bombs. We saw Lance Stroll. That was a crazy move, wasn't it? Straight down the middle. Yeah, it was brilliant.
Yeah, so Norris coming through in first, Sainz in second, Russell in third. I mean, Chen, what was your sort of reaction when you saw that start? I know it was like one of the most exciting starts like we've had this season.
Yeah, it was extremely exciting. I mean, the way that Sainz managed to get that slipstream after that first corner and then managed to get a good couple of seconds lead. And yeah, just the first few laps was really interesting to see Russell holding up the whole grid as well with the slower Williams.
Yeah, so obviously we did have qualifying. We even forgot to mention that, the wet qualifying, which I will come to after we play the next song. But I mean, Cam, I'll come to you finally. Like, what were your opinions on that start?
I mean, Sochi, it always has the potential just because there is so much ability to slipstream going into that first corner. And I think for Lando Norris, almost getting ahead, I think, was probably the worst thing for him because it allowed some drivers like Carlos Sainz to really be able to come forward and take that lead from the start. I think, yeah, it was a really good start, I think, from Sainz to get himself into that position and probably enabled him to sort of be around for the podium later on. But yeah, Lance Stroll, I think, as Jack said, fantastic start. And Lewis Hamilton, of course, I think it does show sometimes when you do have these long slipstreaming starts how important it is to get yourself into a bit of space and how these little pockets of space that you think may be there aren't often there. And certainly put Lewis Hamilton on the back foot very early on.
Sorry. Yeah, as you mentioned there, Lewis Hamilton sort of making a run up the inside. Had Carlos Sainz not moved over, he would have maybe even taken the lead from Lando Norris. But Sainz moves over, Lewis Hamilton has to back off, and then he's sort of swamped by Stroll and Alonso, who sort of did an interesting strategy for turn one. Like, I'll come to you, Jag, if you want to explain it a bit more.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's not much to explain, is there? We saw, I think it was last year, Sainz did almost the same thing, but he tried to straight line it through that mini chicane they've got up with the foam boundaries, and he smacked into the wall. So, there's some, so if I'll explain it, pretty much, he just ignored the corner, he went straight on. He saw a straight line through the chicane that they'd set up, and he went for it, and it proved to be a good strategy, but it was a very risky one. So, yeah, I think most people, seeing what he did, probably would have had a problem with it, but yeah, I wouldn't have the balls to do that if I were him.
Yeah, no, Chen, obviously it's a strategy that I guess isn't really in the sport, like, spirit of, like, the sport. Obviously everyone's got their own opinions on what is and isn't, like, okay, but it's legal. Like, what he did was legal, and to be honest, it's arguably the FIA's fault that they haven't sort of. They've always had an issue with that corner. I remember at every race you see drivers going across that massive runoff area just because the turn is so tight and it just lends itself to like drifting out wide and then coming back on. But maybe they need to do something else. I mean, would you say what Alonso did was fair?
I mean, yeah. I mean, I mean, he didn't take any massive advantage out of anybody, to be honest. And yeah, as long as like he doesn't jeopardize anybody else's race, I do feel that if they have to come off the track, they come off the track.
Yeah, and then I guess one final driver we'll talk about at the start was Lance Stroll, who really proved that slipstream can have a massive effect. He jumped from P8 to P4, sort of like getting ahead of Hamilton, getting ahead of Ricciardo, getting ahead of Alonso, and to be honest, that sort of set the stages for what was a bit of a boring first half of the race, but Jack, have you got any final words to say, especially on Lance Stroll or in fact anyone else at the start of the race?
Yeah, I think Stroll's proven that he's pretty good in the wet, especially in Turkey last year. He took the pole and led for the first 40 odd laps or so. But yeah, he proved it again, didn't he? Straight in the middle. I guess it was a drying track at that point, wasn't it? Or was
I think it was a dry one.
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm thinking of Turkey as well because we're going to come on to that later. But yeah, no, he's come through in the last couple of years, and that's one of the big moments that proves that he should be in that Aston Martin seat. Maybe he shouldn't have had that chance originally, but he's definitely there to stay now, and that's not just because of money anymore.
Yeah, but maybe we'll talk about Lance Stroll later in one of his not so favourable moments. But so we'll get back to the race, and we'll get into sort of just the first few laps where we almost thought that it was going to be like a bit of a boring race, like typical Sochi, like just a bit of a procession. But I think one thing I definitely noticed was just how close the cars were together. I'm not sure if that I can't really remember a Sochi race where we've sort of had that closeness before.
Yeah, no, I think most of it was because of how much the qualifying mixed things up. We had a bit of a procession. It's not procession, a queue behind Russell, definitely, and at the front as well. But yeah, I don't think it was quite as boring a first few laps as you make it out to be. We did see a couple of overtakes from Hamilton as well, and there was obviously, I'm sure we'll get onto in just a second, there was very early pit stops from a few people down the field as well, which made a big difference in the end to the race.
Yeah, perhaps I'm not giving it enough credit because obviously we had that mixed up qualifying, the wet to dry track, and we had a lot of drivers at the back of the field who would normally be at the front. We had Verstappen, Bottas, Leclerc was coming through the field. I mean, Chen, do you think I'm being a bit harsh on the start of the race and that there were a few more overtakes than I'm probably giving it credit for?
I mean, your opinion is valid as well, but I think the fact that all the cars were really close to each other in the front, and then obviously people like Bottas, Leclerc, and Verstappen coming in from the back, slowly making their way through the field, it wasn't as boring as you would say, in my opinion. Yeah,
I mean, I'll come to you, Cam. Finally, the start of the race, it was setting up for an intriguing one. I think I've sort of changed my opinion, and that maybe it was setting up for a potentially really good race, but there was also the sort of inkling that we might just get a Sochi snooze fest.
Possibly. I mean, a lot of it was, I think, dependent on two things. Firstly, how quickly Lewis Hamilton was able to get back towards the front of the field and potentially get back into lead, because I didn't really have a doubt he'd be able to do it. And I feel like, again, it was until he got himself about lap 28, lap 30, around that time when he was just behind Norris, where we felt, okay, this is when we're going to settle more into the lull of the two of them fighting out. But the fact that I think Lewis Hamilton particularly kept behind Daniel Ricciardo for so long, I think was able to, just keep a bit more of the action going throughout the race. Of course, the second driver in that point, Max Verstappen as well, I think just him going throughout the field, I think was always going to be, really fun to see. And all the different strategies as well. I think that was something that I think is really important to reflect on Sunday. With Sochi, you typically have a very binary one-stop race. You make your stop at the same time. Pretty much all the drivers will do either a medium to hard or a hard to medium. It'll be the same strategy. We had so many different strategies in terms of the times that the cars were coming into the pits. The rain as well just threw in a bit more jeopardy at the end. So, yes, there were so many. I think the mixed-up grid, created quite a lot of different elements that were coming into this race in terms of the strategy, in terms of the racing throughout the field. It was a lot closer than normal, probably because McLaren was leading. that did make it a more interesting Grand Prix, that's for sure.
Yeah, so as you mentioned there with the pit stops, like we had a different pit stop strategy at Sochi. Finally, we'll come on later to our predictions. I said maybe 3+ stops. We didn't have quite that many, but we were getting what would have, I guess, been 2-stop strategies. I know George Russell pitted early, Carlos Sainz pitted early, and then we had the interesting situation where some drivers were sticking to a 1-stop and some drivers were going to 2. I mean, we've never really seen that before, have we, at Sochi, Jack?
No, I'm not sure if it was a 2-stop strategy or if it was just like a really early first stop. Because when you think about it, it wasn't actually that early in the grand scheme of things. We were about a third of the way into the Grand Prix when we started seeing them. But you know, some people were taking the mediums to lap 37, I think. When Alonso was the last stopper, he was way up there. And it was only 53 laps in the Grand Prix. So yeah, I think it could still have been a 1-stop, but they were traditionally a lot earlier than we see them at that circuit. Yeah,
I think possibly it might have been almost a 2-stop strategy initially, and then going into it, they realised, or the teams that did pit that early realised either A, they could get the tyres to the end of the race, or B, that a 2-stop just wouldn't work. I mean, would you agree, Chen?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. I mean, the only probably thing is that probably Max had a slight chance of going for 2-stopper because I think he did kind of use the hards a bit too much when trying to get up the field, especially when he got into the points. So, but otherwise, everybody else, I think the tyre degradation was enough for 1-stop. I don't think so anybody was really looking at 2-stopper.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come to you, Cam, finally. Just the tyre strategies made that, like, I know you said before the tyre strategies made that race interesting, but do you think the teams were maybe initially thinking of a 2-stop and then dropped it back down to 1 when they realised that couldn't work?
There's never been a race in Sochi where 2 stops have been the norm. The only time I can remember a 2-stop being the norm, or for one driver, was Charles Leclerc getting onto the podium in 2019, and a lot of that was because he wanted to go for the fastest lap at the end of the race. So yeah, there's tyre degradation in Sochi, but it's not a track where the tyres typically wear out and you have to go for 2 stops, and the option for a 2-stop becomes one, say, unlike Catalonia, where you can have that time differential. You don't have that in Sochi. And so, yeah, I think it was... I think the wet qualifying helps, definitely, because it gave the teams in the top 10 the ability to start on a completely different set of tyres to perhaps what they normally would to get out of Q2. Again, I think so much throughout the weekend, the conditions and everything, I think, just kind of came into play to create this really interesting race with different strategies taking place. And at the end of the day, I think that was what made it a more fun race than we're used to in Sochi. And I think it goes to show just how much I think a little bit of rain can spice things up and the impact that has a lot more widely throughout the weekend.
Yeah, and as we'll talk about after the break, we'll come on to that rain and just how, like, chaotic it made those final few laps. And now what we'll do is we'll come on to some of the individual performances over the weekend, especially, I guess, focusing on 2 of the 3 British drivers, starting with Lando Norris. It's really tragic to see after arguably his best weekend of the season.
Yeah, I mean, I know you said arguably. I think I'd argue that he's had better performances, but I think the timing was right for him to win that race. And sometimes in F1, it doesn't matter that you're not having, you're not the fastest car on track. Sometimes you've got the guts and you've got the desire, and I felt like he had that. And maybe that's what led to his downfall eventually, which I'm sure we'll mention shortly.
Yeah, so qualifying on pole by half a second in a very bonkers qualifying, as we've mentioned a lot. I mean, Chen, what was your reaction when you saw that he was purple and he was purple again, and then he eventually stuck it on pole for the first time in his career?
I mean, I was just ecstatic to see something like Lando Norris just become so fast at the track, and that too being on the front wheel alongside his best friend Carlos Sainz. It was just a fantastic sight to see.
Yeah, especially you mentioned there, we obviously had the Carlando 1-2 from last year, teammates, and it's just the fact that they are friends, and we did see all 3 of the British drivers in the top 4. I mean, I can't think of the last time one nationality had that sort of level of dominance on a front row.
I'm just trying to think back. I mean, possibly the last example I could think of, if you could have PK is Senna back in the late 80s, or possibly British drivers, I think, all the way back to the 60s. I mean, that is how long ago it was, and how I think just how good it shows the future of British motorsport is that we've got so many fantastic young drivers coming through. On the point of Carl Lando as well, I wonder what Netflix are going to be thinking of right now, how they're going to just construe that relationship again for the purposes of entertainment. You know, the competition of Carlos and Lando on the front row, is this what finally breaks them? I can't wait to see what Netflix will do with that.
Yeah, so obviously you mentioned there, like, Netflix always have a way, and I'm sure they'll have a way of making this race interesting as well. But it was even a return to the early 2000s with the front three. But as we saw during the race, Sainz getting ahead of Lando Norris. But then Lando coming back and overtaking the Ferrari into turn, I think it was turn 3, or it might have been turn 1. I'm not sure, Jack.
Yeah, well, they didn't show it on TV, I don't think. So I'd love to comment on how good the overtake was, but we just don't know, do we? Yeah, no, that was absolute credit to Lando there. Ferrari and McLaren have been close on pace all season, and Sochi's kind of a middling difficulty on overtaking. So, yeah, to overtake there, absolutely credit to Lando. I assume it was a brilliant move.
Yeah, so the TV direction left a bit to be desired this weekend, but I think we just caught the final seconds of it. We didn't see the run on Lando got on Carlos Sainz, but we saw the eventual overtake. And I mean, Jem, what was your reaction when you saw the McLaren get past the Ferrari?
I mean, to be brutally honest, I wasn't really surprised, especially with Lando's consistency all year with the pace he's been showing in that McLaren, and just the pace difference between the McLaren and the Ferrari in a straight line. And I suppose because Lando's just been pushing Sainz for that whole 10 laps or so that he was behind Sainz, I wasn't really surprised that Lando did eventually get past Carlos.
Yeah, and then once he got past Carlos, he was very much in the lead. Maybe Sainz pitted a bit early, didn't really seem to be able to get back up to Lando, but I mean, he was putting in a really, really good performance, really dominant. Just like as almost Hamilton or a Verstappen-esque performance up front, holding time and just being able to drive with a little bit less pressure.
Yeah, well, at the start of the season, we saw Lando being the best of the rest outside of those top 4 drivers. But with Perez and Bottas, I don't think they've faded, but I think the midfield are stepping up again and again. And I think he's probably the third fastest driver on the grid now, maybe. So when you take Hamilton and put him in 7th, when you take Verstappen and put him right at the back of the grid, and then you put Lando on the front, you expect him to deliver, right? And he definitely did. So yeah. I mean, he should have had something from that race. Yeah,
so we'll come on to eventually what happened with Lando Norris a bit later when we talk about just those last 5 laps in the rain. But we'll talk about another driver quickly, another British driver in Lewis Hamilton, who initially appeared to sort of be having a bit of an out of sorts weekend, only qualifying 4th and then obviously dropping to 7th after the start of the race.
I mean, yeah, it was surprising, especially in qualifying, to see Lewis just battering that Mercedes. I mean, during the practice weekends, he knocked over one of the pit crew members, like Stroll did a while back, and then he bumped into the pit wall, and then obviously he slid off in the final stages of qualifying, and then see him just fall back in the 7th place in the beginning. That's not the Lewis Hamilton we've come to see over the years, but then thankfully, he did show why he is a 7-time world champion with the drive he did.
Yeah, I mean, Cam, it's a bit weird this season. He seems to be making like a few more mistakes. Obviously, as Shay mentioned, hitting the mechanic in practice. Obviously, we've had that happen before. It's arguably just it's probably not a simple mistake, but it's a mistake that really maybe anyone could make. We saw him clout the wall in qualifying and then spin, and that probably cost him a run at pole. Do you think that Hamilton is making more mistakes this season, and if so, why?
I think there's certainly more pressure on him with Verstappen. I don't think he's had a championship fight this close since the Rosberg era. And certainly then we did see some mistakes in Lewis's early time at Mercedes. I mean, I do think that's played a part. And to be honest, Lewis Hamilton would not be leading the championship right now if it weren't for Max Verstappen being taken out by him on the first lap at Silverstone, and then Valtteri Bottas crashing into him in the first lap in Hungary. So yeah, I think Lewis realises he's lucky to be leading the World Championship, but I do think at the end of the day, Lewis is still one of the most consistent drivers on the grid. He is making more mistakes, sure. He's still making less mistakes than a lot of drivers, and to a certain extent you could argue that Verstappen has been making some mistakes as well this season. I just think that's the nature of the championship fight. I can't really say more than that. I think it is just the nature of the fight being a bit closer this season. I think has put a bit more pressure on both drivers. But again, Lewis isn't making... It's not like he's radically making more mistakes. It's not like he's costing himself a world championship here, Lewis. It's just the nature of the fight. And I think that is something I think certainly keeping it a bit more interesting.
But even after Hamilton dropped to 7th, he sort of returned to the Lewis Hamilton that we know. He was stuck behind Daniel Ricciardo for a while in a bit of a DRS train, but it appeared that by the end of the race, it appeared that he had sort of been conserving his tyres because he obviously made those mediums last so long. Maybe he was just sticking behind Ricciardo, and then in the pit stops he managed to jump the McLaren.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of a conspiracy theorist view. I think no racing driver is going to go in there and not try and pass their competitor. Yeah, sometimes it's difficult with a slipstream. Maybe there was he just didn't, maybe he wasn't ready for a dive bomb on lap 10 or whatever it was. But yeah, I can't imagine he was too conservative at that point. But I think Lewis tends to step up when he's put in that kind of adversity. When we saw at Silverstone, he took a 10-second penalty and he came through and he won that race. And driver of any other calibre might not have done that. And I think we've got the same exact thing here in Sochi.
Yeah, and so after he jumped Ricciardo, he managed to get past a few of the drivers that had pitted a bit earlier and then was making his way up to Lando Norris before eventually we saw the rain hit. Do you think, Jen, that he would have got past Norris had the rain hadn't hit? I know he'd made up quite a bit of the time, or he made up all of the time by the time he got to the back of the McLaren with I think it was about 10-15 laps to go. But obviously getting to a driver and overtaking them is a completely different thing. So do you think he would have got past the McLaren?
I think if there was no rain, then probably eventually Lewis may have got past Norris. But it's kind of a hard one to judge because Hamilton was stuck behind Ricciardo for a long period. And then it was a good solid few laps where Hamilton was within the DRS zone of Lando, but Lando managed to stay ahead this whole time. And I think Hamilton did manage to get through the last final tenths when the rain started pouring down, because obviously Lewis had the experience in the wet compared to Lando, so it's kind of hard to tell with that.
Yeah, and I'll come to you, Cam, finally. Same question. Do you think that Hamilton would have got past Norris without the rain?
Possibly. I don't think it's certain. I mean, we've seen, and Sochi is, of all the tracks, it's the one where it's hardest to follow. The way that the cars produce so much wake, it's difficult for the cars to follow in that dirty air. And we've seen, of course, Lewis is struggling with Daniel Ricciardo. I don't know, possibly, and this was the thing we were discussing at the time, which was, do we think Lewis Hamilton was just biding his time for one attempt, the only attempt that he feels he's going to get? A bit like Max Verstappen when in the first race of the season, when we talked in Bahrain, he only really had one attempt before he ruined the tyres and would then struggle in the dirty air again. So it could have been that Lewis was holding for that one attempt. I think he probably would have been able to do it, seeing how close he was to Norris and seeing how much of a gap he'd made up. But I wouldn't have counted Norris out either. And we'd seen the McLarens are a difficult car to follow behind. They may not be an easy car to drive. They're equally difficult to follow as well. And I think that might have just swung it in Lando Norris's favour, but you do not discount Lewis Hamilton in doing it in one move. We've seen time and time again him able to pull off these moves, and at the end of the day, that's why he is a 7-time world champion.
But I think I completely agree. I think he might have got past, he might not have, but to be honest, it was all a bit of a moot point when I think it was 6 laps from the end, the rain started to fall, and we'll talk about that after the break. Welcome back to the final part of our Russian GP review, and then we'll sort of move on to the football. But first, we've got to look at our predictions for the Russian Grand Prix. Last week, me and Jack made our predictions, and they're fairly successful. But like, it's hard to predict, especially when the rain comes down right at the end. So what we'll do is it's sort of a competition between the Rowe side and the Warwick F1 Society side, and we will have Chen and Cam, who weren't on the show last week, judging who won. So first, what we'll do is we'll judge it overall, and then there'll be 1 point for the winner. So Jack,
are we going to do this anonymously? Are we going to tell them which set are which?
Oh, that's a good point, actually. We will do this anonymously, because obviously there's a bit of bias here. So, one of us went for a Hamilton win, Bottas second, and Verstappen third. And then the 3 general predictions were 3+ stops for the most of the grid, double Williams points, and Tsunoda into Q3. While the other one went for a Hamilton, Bottas, Perez top 3, with their 3 predictions being Latifi Q2, a safety car on lap 1, and the Hasses crashing into each other. So, I mean, Cam, who would you give it to? Like person 1 or person 2?
You see, the second set of predictions, I feel, were more exactly what I would have said. I have a sneaky feeling I know whose they are. I would say, I mean, podium-wise, I think the first set of predictions got it best. They got 2 out of the 3. Obviously, I don't think we foresaw, Lando Norris in the mixed-up grid and everything. Yeah, I mean, the other set of predictions, I think, some of them very wildly off the mark. Some of them, the second set of the other lot of predictions were kind of more believable. So I am torn, but I think just on the podium, I am going for the first. It's got to be the first set of predictions, I think, that wins it for me.
Okay, so person 1 takes 1 point. I mean, Chen, do you agree, or would you give it to person 2?
Yeah, I would agree as well. I mean, the podium was almost completely correct. Obviously, with the rain, no one could really know what would happen, especially with the unpredictability of the rain. So yeah, I'll first say person 1 as well.
So person 1 takes it, and person 1 is me.
Drat.
I'm gonna be honest. I think that's slightly harsh from our guests here. You got the Latifi Q2 right.
Yeah, and he didn't even start Q2, so I can still claim that he would have gotten into Q3 as well.
Yeah, so we got Latifi Q2 right, but I think it was just the top 3 that gave it to me. I was getting 2 right, 1 in the wrong order. But just
in all fairness, you semi-predicted the rain. You said 3 stops for everyone, but I think you got the kind of the attitude right, even if you weren't technically correct.
All right, so that's a 1-0 lead for the Raw Sports side, but obviously we can't do next time without predictions either, and this time we're going to give, obviously, because we've got one Warwick F1 Society fresher here, Cam Hall, head of news at Raw, so obviously on the Raw side, so we're going to give them the chance to make their top 3 predictions and just 3 general predictions from throughout the weekend. So I'll write them down, and I guess we'll start with Cam.
So as well as Raw, I'm also going to stick this in as a prediction for the Armchair F1 podcast, my little personal podcast. Find us on social media, Armchair F1 Pod, and across all major streaming platforms. Anyway, self-promo out of the way. Yeah, Turkish Grand Prix is an interesting one. I think last year's race, threw up the fact that I think it was so unpredictable, the fact that the track was so slippy, no one expected that. I don't know if they're going to do any more changes onto that track. So I think for potentially playing it safe, just because I think there are so many variables that there could be in Turkey, Hamilton victory.
All right.
Verstappen in second, and I will say Lando Norris to come in third. Sure, he had the difficult last few laps in Sochi, but he's in a very rich vein of form, and I think he's going to follow that up into another podium. In terms of my 3 other predictions, I'm going to say probably if the track is very slippy, and at least 3 Nikita Mazepin spins in the race, and that I feel is me being slightly optimistic. I think as well, being Turkey, I think there will be that long straight is DRS heaven. So I think this will involve quite a counting game, this. But I am going to say at least 25 DRS overtakes on the main straight, I think down to turn 14, or the turn 12 to 14, whatever number it is in there.
You just want to make our lives harder, don't you?
Actually, going to have to pay attention during the races.
And then I will say, because again of the unknowns on predictions and strategies, I will say at least 2 stops from every driver who finishes the race.
Okay, so we've gone. So Cam or Rowe has gone for Hamilton, Verstappen, Norris, 3 Mazepin spins, 25 plus DRS overtakes, and 2 stops for everyone on the grid. And I will be holding it. if like. I'll give you, if a driver retires, then they're out of it. They can't do the 1 stop and then crash or have an issue. If all the drivers that finish have to have done more than 2 stops.
And that's the prediction I'm probably most confident in as well.
Okay. So, Chen, do you want to give us the Warwick F1 Society side of the picture? So, the top 3 and then just 3 general predictions from throughout the weekend.
I would say the podium is a bit more of a risk. I've gone for a Verstappen win, Leclerc second, and Norris third. Especially with Leclerc getting a brand new engine, and which is going to be a bit more powerful, which should give that Ferrari a bit more legs in the straight as well. And Verstappen, he was pretty quick last year until he ended up spinning trying to overtake Perez. So, and I reckon probably something's going to happen between the Verstappen and Hamilton again. In terms of the 3 predictions, I'm predicting Giovinazzi points, a McLaren front row in qualifying, and probably Sainz taking the engine penalty for the new Ferrari engine.
Okay, so let me know if I've got this right. So we had a Verstappen, Norris, Leclerc, top 3. Gio points.
It was Leclerc Norris.
Oh, Leclerc Norris. You got to make sure, otherwise.
When we get it right, when we get this right next week, you'll remember.
Exactly.
Or 2 weeks time.
I'd say if anyone gets the top 3 perfect, they get like 2 points or something. Because you never know. Especially, I don't know how Turkey is. Is it still slippery? And will it be raining? It's too early to say. But yes, so it was Verstappen, Leclerc, Norris. I've got that right. Gio points, McLaren front row, and then you're going to have to remind me of the final one quickly.
It was Sainz taking the engine penalty because of the new Ferrari unit.
Okay, so Sainz engine penalty, and yeah, that is it. Finally, I guess just quickly, everyone give me their what they would give that race out of 10. So we'll start with Jack.
I'm going to have to say, only because Norris crashed out, it was an 8 out of 10. If he'd have won it, 10 out of 10, easy peasy.
Yep, so Chen?
Yeah, I would probably say 8.5, mainly because it was a fantastic race for Sochi standards.
Cam?
I said 7 at the start, but the more we've been discussing this race, I think I'm going to up it to an 8, which for Sochi is just incredible. And it's almost making me realise, do we need to go to Agora Drive now? If we can just have that every season.
No, we definitely do. But I'd also give it an 8 out of 10, a race that none of us were expecting to be that good. And I think one that will live long in the memory.
Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed that. You can check out our podcast on the Raw Sports Spotify or on the Warwick F1 Society YouTube in future. We'll be back again in the studio next week, but we've got a full 2-hour slot, so we'll be back to normal length. See you then.